The foreclosure notice was nailed to the fence post on a Wednesday morning in August, 1882, and by the time Duncan Rowe pulled it free with hands that had worked cattle for 30 years, the paper was already warping in the Texas heat. 14 words from First National Bank of Amarillo. 14 words that could end a man's life's work. Duncan Rowe was 52 years old. He had built Rowe's Crossing Ranch from nothing, a borrowed mule, $200, and a stubbornness that most men in the Texas Panhandle called a fault and that he had always chosen to call a virtue. 25 years of drought and flood and cattle fever and market collapses, and he had outlasted everyone. But 3 consecutive bad years had worn him down the way water wears stone, not all at once, but patiently without mercy. 12,000 acres of panhandle land, a herd of 8,000 cattle. A limestone main house built solid enough to outlast any man who lived in it. All of it now sitting under $18,000 of debt, with 60 days left before the bank came to collect what remained. His foreman, a raw-boned man named Earl Rigsby, who had been with the ranch for 12 years, found him still standing at that fence post an hour later. The sharp reply came, Duncan said without turning around. Rigsby was quiet for a moment. That was never a good sign. The Sharpes of New Orleans had once operated the largest dry goods and shipping concern along the Gulf Coast. 3 years prior, Duncan had invested $12,000 in their expansion venture, money he could not easily spare, but the returns had looked certain, and Victor Sharpe had been persuasive. The venture collapsed. Victor Sharpe lost everything, including Duncan's investment. What remained of the Sharpe family now lived in a house they could barely afford to heat, and a reputation they were still figuring out how to survive. 2 weeks ago, a letter had arrived from Victor Sharpe, carefully worded, polite to the point of discomfort. Victor Sharpe could not repay the debt. He acknowledged this plainly and without excuse. But he had a daughter, Adelaide Sharpe, 26 years old, who had worked in her father's offices since she was old enough to manage a ledger. She understood accounting, contract law, supply chain management, and trade negotiation. Victor Sharpe was proposing her as a bride, in lieu of the money, on the reasoning that a woman who understood the business side of a struggling operation might be of practical use. It was, Duncan had told Rigsby privately, the most undignified arrangement he had ever encountered. He had also written back to say yes. "You're sure about this?" Rigsby asked. "No," Duncan said, "but I'm sure about losing everything if I do nothing, so I'm doing something." Adelaide Sharpe arrived on a Friday afternoon, not by train to Amarillo, followed by an arranged wagon, but driving herself. A borrowed conveyance, she explained later, because she hadn't wanted to put anyone out on her account. She was 26 years old, and she looked every year of it, which is to say she looked young enough that 2 of the ranch hands assumed she was someone's daughter passing through, not the new mistress of Rowe's Crossing. Duncan walked toward the wagon slowly, taking stock before either of them spoke. She sat straight on the bench, reins easy in both hands, wearing a sensible brown traveling dress, with the sleeves already rolled past her elbows despite the dust and the heat. One small trunk in the wagon bed, a leather satchel on the bench beside her. That was everything she had brought. She was looking at him with dark brown eyes that were running the same kind of assessment he was running on her, taking measurements, reaching preliminary conclusions. "Mr. Duncan Rowe," she said, "not a question." "Miss Adelaide Sharpe," he said, "you drove yourself." "I know how to drive a wagon," she said, climbing down without waiting for assistance. "And I assumed you'd have enough on your hands without riding to Amarillo to collect me." He had prepared himself for several versions of this meeting. He had prepared for a woman who was resentful of the arrangement and couldn't hide it. He had prepared for brittle dignity worn like armor over genuine fear. He had prepared for the particular kind of helplessness that some people performed when they wanted you to feel responsible for them. He had not prepared for practicality. "You should know," Adelaide continued, brushing road dust from her skirt and turning to face him with the directness of someone who had decided that the most efficient thing was to simply say what was true, "that I didn't come here because I had no other options. I came because my father's mistake cost you $12,000, and I'm in a position to be genuinely useful in a way that a direct repayment never could be. I'd like this to be a working arrangement, not a charity situation, not a performance, a working arrangement." Duncan, who was 52 years old and had long since stopped expecting to be surprised, was surprised. "All right," he said after a pause. "The account books are in the study." "Good," she said. "I was going to ask for those first." They were married the following Tuesday by a circuit preacher, with Rigsby and Mrs. Burkett, the housekeeper, as witnesses. Adelaide wore a gray dress she said was her best. Duncan wore his good coat. The ceremony took 11 minutes. They did not pretend at things that were not yet there, which Mrs. Burkett found upsetting and which both of them found, privately, more respectful than the alternative. That evening, Adelaide sat down with 3 years of ranch ledgers and did not look up for 4 hours. Duncan sat across the room with a newspaper he wasn't reading, watching her work out of the corner of his eye. She moved very little, a stillness he recognized from good working dogs, from men who had been doing something long enough that it no longer required any movement beyond what was necessary. Eyes across a column, hand to make a notation, back to the column. "You're overwintering your herd on the south pasture," she said without looking up. "I've been wintering cattle for 30 years, he said. "I know." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a line of feed expenses. "You're paying supplemental feed costs from an Amarillo supplier at a rate roughly 20% above what you'd pay if you contracted with 3 smaller regional suppliers and staggered your orders across the season. And you're hauling water to that pasture when the creek bend half a mile east would give you access without the labor cost." Duncan looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "You've been on this property for 6 hours, he said. "The numbers have been here longer than that," she said. "I'm just reading them." Over the following weeks, Adelaide changed the ranch the way she worked, without announcement, steadily, one thing at a time. She renegotiated the feed contract. She adjusted the grazing rotation. She found that the wagon maintenance accounting had contained a consistent error for 2 years, which accounted for a discrepancy of $700 that had been quietly draining profit margins without anyone identifying the source. She worked alongside the hands with the matter-of-factness of someone who considers a task either worth doing or not worth doing, and if worth doing without ceremony. She asked questions of everyone who had answers, the hand who had worked the land for 15 years, the young man fresh out of Kansas, Rigsby himself. She did not perform helplessness and she did not perform competence. She simply did the work. Duncan could not settle on what to make of her, and the not settling bothered him more than he had expected. He had assumed she would be useful. He had not expected to find himself noting, on a ride out to check the north fence line, that she had suggested pulling it 6 feet east to account for flooding, and that she had been correct. He had not expected to watch her negotiate with a feed supplier in the yard one morning, and feel something that was not quite pride but was close enough to warrant examination. He was 52 years old. He was not accustomed to being caught off guard by his own interior life. Then came September and the matter of Clifton Nash. Clifton Nash was 48 years old, and he owned the largest ranch in the eastern Panhandle, and he had been waiting for Rosed Crossing to fail for at least 2 years. He had made a quiet inquiry to First National before the foreclosure notice had even reached Duncan. He was a patient man, and patient men in the cattle business understood that opportunity wore the face of other people's misfortune. What Duncan had not known, what Adelaide found, was that Nash had also been working the cattle brokerage contracts. She came to him on a Saturday morning in October, with a ledger open in her hands and an expression that was very precise and very steady. "Your cattle broker," she said. "A man named Grady Moss. He has been systematically undervaluing your herd at sale and collecting a percentage of the difference from Nash's operation. It's been happening for 30 months. Duncan set down his coffee cup. "I want to show you the full picture," she said. She laid out the contracts on the kitchen table. 3 years of brokerage agreements, sale receipts, and market reports she had written away for 2 weeks prior. The pattern, once she walked him through it, was unmistakable. The total amounted to nearly $4,000 over the period. "How did you find this?" he asked. "I was trying to explain why your margins were lower than the herd numbers should produce," she said. "This is why." He read through the documents twice, deliberately, the way he read anything that mattered. "I'll go to Amarillo on Monday," he said. "I'd like to come with you," Adelaide said. He looked up at her. "Moss will be more careful with his answers if there are 2 of us. And I understand the contracts better than anyone who might be in that room." What followed was the moment Duncan would return to for the rest of his life. Not because it was particularly remarkable to observe from the outside, but because of what it cost him and what it showed him about the size of his own blind spots. He said no. Not harshly. He said he would handle it, that she had done her part by identifying the problem, and he would take it from there. He said it in the way that men of his time and place said such things, as though the logic were self-evident, as though the matter were already settled by the simple nature of things. Adelaide said, "All right." She folded the documents and went back to work. He rode to Amarillo on Monday. He returned on Wednesday with nothing resolved. Moss had denied everything, and without Adelaide there to walk through the specific chain of analysis. With the precision the broker kept demanding, Duncan had found himself unable to articulate what he knew to be true in a way that left the man no room. He came home with a long ride's worth of frustration and the particular shame of a man who has made an avoidable mistake. Adelaide was in the study when he arrived. She read his face in the way she had of reading things, and she understood without being told. "I should have let you come," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, you should have." Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of being proven right. Simply with the honesty of a statement that was true and that both of them knew to be true. "I'll go back Friday," he said, "with you." On Friday, they rode to Amarillo together. Adelaide sat across a table from Grady Moss and presented 30 months of contract fraud with the methodical calm of someone who had been adding columns since she was 9 years old, and who understood not simply that the numbers were wrong, but exactly why they were wrong, and precisely how every person in that room would need to see it laid out before they could claim not to understand. Moss admitted to the arrangement within 20 minutes. The full legal resolution required 3 months, 2 attorneys, and a deposition that Adelaide delivered without once losing her thread or raising her voice. By February, Clifton Nash had been forced out of his stake in the brokerage firm. Duncan had recovered $6,200 in documented damages, and the foreclosure debt to First National had been reduced to a figure the ranch could carry without strain. On the cold ride home from the Amarillo courthouse, Duncan said, "I was wrong to go without you the first time." Adelaide looked at him from under the brim of her hat. "I know," she said. "You were also wrong about the east fence line. I didn't hold that against you either." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes when something finally loosens in a person who has been tightened too long. It was the first time she had heard it. She thought it was a very good sound. Now, friends, let me step away from the story for just a moment, because I want to ask, where are you listening from today? Are you somewhere in Texas, or maybe Tennessee, the Carolinas, Missouri? Or perhaps you're across the water, in England, France, Canada, Brazil, somewhere I'd never think to guess. Drop your location in the comments below. These Prairie Heart stories travel farther than I ever expect them to, and I love knowing which corners of the world they reach. If this story is sitting with you today, let it show, leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep growing this community together. All right, back to Duncan and Adelaide. There is no clean moment in a life where love begins. It doesn't make an announcement. It arrives sideways, in the middle of a disagreement about pasture rotation, or in the silence at the end of a long day when both people are too tired to perform anything and what remains between them is something honest. It was spring, April, pushing into May, when Duncan Rowe understood that he had stopped thinking of the ranch as something he was struggling to hold and started thinking of it as something the two of them were building together. The pronoun had shifted without his noticing, the way seasons shift. Adelaide Sharpe was 26 years old, and she moved through the world with the self-possession of someone who had learned early that no one was going to make things easier on her account. So she might as well stop waiting for that to change. She had a laugh she didn't spend carelessly, which meant that when it appeared, it landed. She thought faster than most people he had met, and she had the rare quality of also listening, genuinely listening, not simply waiting for her turn. He was 52 years old, and he was falling in love with his wife the way water finds its level. Without drama, and then all at once, and then as though it had always been this way. He told her on an evening in May, sitting on the porch while the Panhandle sunset went through its colors, the particular way the sky over flat country burns before dark, orange and rose, and something that makes a person feel, briefly, that the trouble of everything might be worth it. "I want to say something plainly," he said. "What I thought this arrangement was when you arrived, it isn't that. Hasn't been for a while." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "No," she agreed, "it isn't. I'm not a man who says things easily," he said, "but I'm grateful you came, and not for what you did with the ledgers." She looked at him with those dark eyes that still, after months, had the quality of reading a person more carefully than most people were comfortable being read. "I came because my father asked me to," she said, "but I stayed because I chose to. There's a difference." He took her hand. She did not pull away. 7 years is enough time to build a life and then have enough distance to understand what you have built. By 1889, Rose Crossing covered 22,000 acres. The herd had doubled. Adelaide had established a quarter-horse breeding program that brought buyers from across 3 territories. She had also, beginning in the 2nd year of their marriage, started consulting informally for neighboring operations that were struggling. A drought response strategy here, a supply chain restructure there. Until the consulting became, without any announcement or formal designation, a recognized part of what the ranch offered to the region. The other ranchers in the Panhandle had opinions about this, as they always had opinions about anything that didn't fit the shape of what they were used to. Some of those opinions found their way to Duncan. He listened to them with the patience of a man who has made up his mind and sees no reason to be loud about it. "My wife," he would say simply, "is the most capable business mind in this part of Texas. If that's difficult for you to account for, that's going to cost you, not me." It usually concluded the conversation. Their daughter, Ivy, was born in 1884, and by the time she was old enough to read, she was already sitting beside her mother at the account books, asking questions about how the numbers connected to the cattle and the land and the decisions that flowed from both. She grew up knowing, without being told in so many words, that capable women were not exceptional. They were simply the part of the world that didn't always get recognized. Their son, Arthur, followed 2 years later and showed early evidence of his father's love of the land paired with his mother's comfort with numbers, which Duncan thought privately was the most useful combination a person could inherit. In the summer of 1889, a young man arrived at Rowe's Crossing on a horse that had been pushed hard. His name was Spencer Culver, 29 years old, from a small ranch in the Oklahoma Territory that was 6 months from failing. He had heard about Rowe's Crossing through the slow network of word of mouth that moves among people who work the land. Stories that travel without hurry and stick to the people who most need them. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said that he didn't know what else to do. Adelaide came out of the house and listened to him for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you some things that will go against what you've been taught. Are you willing to hear them?" Spencer Culver said he was willing. They spent the following 6 weeks with him. Adelaide redesigned his entire operation from the feed contracts out. Duncan helped him identify better breeding stock and put him in contact with brokers who could be trusted. They did not charge him. When Spencer left for the territory with a notebook full of Adelaide's recommendations and a list of Duncan's contacts, he was barely able to speak. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. "You don't repay us," Adelaide told him. "When someone comes to you the way you came to us, and someone will, eventually, you help them the same way. That's how it gets repaid." After he rode out, Duncan stood beside Adelaide in the late afternoon and watched the dust settle behind him on the road. "Your father's business taught you that," he said. "My father's failures taught me that," she said. "When the company went under, there were people who helped us get through the worst of it. People who had no obligation to. I haven't forgotten that." He looked at her, this woman who had driven a borrowed wagon 300 miles to honor a debt that was not hers to honor, who had turned a failing ranch into the strongest operation in the Panhandle, who had argued with brokers and testified in courtrooms, and somewhere in the middle of all of it had made him feel, at 52 years old, that life still held things he hadn't yet seen. "I told Rigsby when you arrived," he said, "that this was a practical arrangement and nothing more." "Rigsby mentioned that," she said, and there was the laugh, quick and private, just the two of them. "I was wrong about most things that summer," he said. "The fence line, the broker, leaving you behind in Amarillo." He paused. You were willing to be wrong," she said. "That's the part that actually mattered. Most men aren't willing to be wrong, and the ones who are tend to do it quietly, so no one notices. You admitted it out loud. To me, and in that courtroom, and when the other ranchers came around asking questions." She paused. "That's not a small thing, Duncan." He had been written about in the Amarillo paper 3 times. Once about the legal case against Nash and the broker. Once about the breeding program. Once about what the reporter had called the singular partnership at Rowe's Crossing, which has become a model studied by operations throughout the territory. In that last article, the reporter had asked Duncan how it had happened. How a ranch 60 days from foreclosure had become the most successful operation in the Panhandle. Duncan had said, "I stopped assuming I already knew the most important things, and I started listening to the person standing next to me. That was the whole of it." When the reporter asked Adelaide the same question, she said, "He was 52 years old and still willing to change his mind. You'd be surprised how rare that is." It turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Ivy Rowe, at 21, was the first woman admitted to the Texas Cattlemen's Regional Association when it was formally organized in 1895. It caused considerable discussion. Her mother, who was 43 by then, and whose name was known across 4 territories as the woman you called when your operation was struggling, said only, "Good, she earned it." People asked Duncan in those later years what he would tell a younger man. A man standing at a fence post with a foreclosure notice in his hand and no clear path forward. He was 64 years old by the time the question had weight behind it, and he had thought about the answer long enough to give it without hesitation. He would say, "A woman arrived on this property with a borrowed wagon and one small trunk and a leather satchel full of knowledge she'd earned the hard way, and she was the most capable person I had ever encountered, and I was just wise enough, barely, to stop standing in her way." And if they asked Adelaide, she said, "I came to a stranger's ranch to pay a debt that was not mine to pay." I found a man who was willing to be surprised by what a woman could do. After 30 years of watching men, I can tell you that is not a common thing. It turned out to be the only thing that mattered. The ranch outlasted them both, passed on to Ivy and then to Arthur's children, and then beyond, the land holding the shape of the lives built on it the way good land always does, patiently, permanently, asking only that the work be done honestly. A woman the world had reduced to a line item in a debt settlement, had settled instead into the fullest version of herself, built with her own hands, alongside a man who had been wise enough to recognize that he had received more than he had bargained for, and humble enough to spend the rest of his life being grateful for it. Friends, thank you for spending time with Prairie Hearts today. Wherever you are, Texas or Tennessee, California or Carolina, somewhere across the water in England or France or Brazil, I'm grateful you were here for this one. Duncan and Adelaide's story is a reminder that the people who get written off tend to carry the most, and that real partnership is not the easy thing. It asks something genuine from both people. It asks you to be willing to be wrong. It asks you to listen even when listening goes against everything you were taught. If this story found something in you today, leave a like, leave a comment, pass it along to someone who might need it. Until next time, keep writing, keep building, and may God bless every honest mile of road that's still ahead of you.